Good morning, everybody. If you're on the East Coast of the U.S. like we are, or otherwise, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. My name is Corey Tomlinson, and I'll be your MC for today's webinar, responding to CISA alerts with Nuix. Just before we get into the details of the webinar itself, just our standard disclosure. This presentation may contain certain forward-looking statements. All statements other than statements of historical fact that address activities, events, or developments that the company believes, expects, or anticipates will or may occur in the future are forward-looking statements. They are often, but not always, identified by the use of words such as seek, anticipate, event, or result, may, will, can, should, could, or might occur, can be achieved, and other similar expressions. And as you can see, I won't subject you to the rest of that reading, but essentially, we may be talking about forward-looking statements when it comes to our products or events that could happen in the market. So going back to this, I am happy to have Hoke Smith, who's our VP of Cybersecurity, and Bob O'Leary, Head of Investigations, both of longtime Nuixers and experts in their respective fields. And speaking of Nuix, a lot of people know us from our e-discovery capabilities. But if you follow the company closely, we've been working on the forensics and endpoint security side for years. And we really want to focus on these capabilities today as they pertain to a couple of recent vulnerabilities and attacks that have captured the cybersecurity media's attention when it comes to SolarWinds and also more recent Microsoft Exchange server vulnerabilities. So while we are disturbed and concerned by these attacks, they provide security teams an opportunity to think about their security and evaluate their capabilities moving forward when it comes to the technologies that they use. And it's something that we're going to be putting forth here. So with that being said, I'm going to turn the presentation over to Hoke and Bob to dive a little bit more into the details around the alerts that CISA puts forth that government organizations and smart corporations are following, and how Nuix can be used to answer those and to really be positioned in a defensive and a defensive manner, really. So Hoke, I think you're up. I'll hand it over to you.
Well, very good. Thank you for that, Corey. Appreciate it. And to those of you who connected to the webinar today, thank you guys for your time. Very grateful that you would spend an hour with us today amidst so many Zooms and webinars and other calls. I think we have some interesting material for you. I'm going to share my screen now and attempt to pull up the presentation. And Corey, if you could just confirm you can see this.
I can see it.
Excellent.
Good to go.
Thank you. So as Corey mentioned, what we want to talk about is detection, response, and investigation with Nuix. We're well known for our e-discovery capabilities, but today we want to focus on how, sort of through the lens of these recent cyber attacks, Nuix can help you with the problems of detecting advanced attacks, quickly responding to them, and then doing deeper dive investigations. So we'll just share a bit, Bob and I will, about us and our backgrounds. We'll give you a very quick overview of SolarWinds and Hafnium, maybe for those of you who just aren't focused on this at the moment, just to kind of level set what we're talking about, since we'll be diving a bit more deeply into some of the post-exploit indicators in those attacks. We'll talk about what the government and industry response was in terms of threat intelligence, what the implications for security teams are of these two attacks in particular, at least from our perspective. Certainly, these are things that are will be studied probably for years to come, but there are a few lessons, at least from our perspective, that we wanted to share so far. We'll then go into a fairly in-depth demonstration of Nuix adaptive security and how the SolarWinds related IOCs would be detected to alert you to this kind of attacker on the network. And then with Nuix Workstation, we'll show how collected artifacts would be examined, and we can expose the malware and other techniques that were used as part of the attack in the course of a forensic investigation. So just a bit about me. I'm Vice President of Cybersecurity at Nuix. I spend the vast majority of my time with our customers on their cybersecurity and endpoint security issues. We sort of are looking at, through the lens of endpoint security, at both insider threat and cyber at Nuix. And so that takes up most of my time. When I'm not doing that, I suppose my primary role is as an uncompensated Uber driver for my two teenage daughters. So that's kind of me in a nutshell. Bob, would you mind just introducing yourself?
Not at all. Thank you, Hoke. As Hoke mentioned, my name is Bob O'Leary. I am the head of investigations for Nuix USG and Corporate. By way of background, I retired from the New Jersey State Police High-Tech Crime Unit. I started that unit with one other detective in the late 90s. And I went to work for the National Institute of Justice, primarily doing tool testing and evaluation through the Electronic Crime Technology Center of Excellence, and then also ran professional services for a software company before coming to Nuix about 6.5 years ago. Primarily, my job is to assist clients and customers with their investigations workflows using and leveraging the Nuix product line to maximize their investigative skill set and making the most of their data sets to solve their investigations.
Cool. Thank you, Bob. So I mentioned that we were just going to do a quick overview of these two kind of headline grabbing attacks. And so let's just start with SolarWinds. So SolarWinds, first reported by Mandiant in December 2020. It was attributed to Russian intelligence and resulted in the compromise of SolarWinds servers at somewhere around 18,000 organizations worldwide. Hafnium, first reported by Microsoft on March 2nd of this year, is attributed to a Chinese state-sponsored group of the same name called Hafnium. And that resulted in the compromise of as many as 125,000 servers around the world. I've seen different numbers in terms of the number of unpatched Exchange servers that were affected, that affected on-prem instances of Microsoft Exchange Server. So looking in a bit more detail at these attacks, there's some similarities between them. So in the case of SolarWinds, this started with an attack on the company SolarWinds itself. It's a Texas maker of software products, in particular network monitoring product that is very popular and is actually very well loved by a number of users for monitoring networks, identifying issues on networks and bottlenecks and so forth. So this attack began with a compromise of SolarWinds software build process that allowed the attacker to Trojanize essentially an update to the SolarWinds Orion product. And so once that compromised update was sort of posted by SolarWinds, the administrator could acquire that update, download the update, and then once it was installed on the SolarWinds box, it would perform some internal checks of the network that it was installed on, or the system it was installed on, and then began to beacon out. And so you see that first arrow there to the left where the Trojanized DLL is calling back to the attacker. If the attacker liked the network that he found himself on, or she, so remember that this has been this update was distributed to 18,000 systems worldwide, so there were many potential targets for the attacker to pursue. If they liked what they saw, they would pass a second stage down to the targeted SolarWinds system, and it was that second stage that then would be used to establish persistence, to extract credentials from the host, to move laterally, to execute basically the sort of activities of the kill chain that you would typically use to unpack a cyber attack. And that would, of course, result in a series of secondary compromises. So once the attacker was on the SolarWinds box, that wasn't the primary objective. The primary objective was to get out onto other systems that contained interesting information. As far as we know, this is primarily an espionage or information gathering attack. It's not, that was its intent. So looking over at Hafnium, in this case, the sort of initial access to the target network was not through a compromised update. It was through a direct attack through a chain of zero-day exploits on Microsoft Exchange server. And that allowed the attacker to perform some basic activities on the server, most importantly, writing files to the server. Once they could write a file to the server, then they could basically begin communication with that web shell and steal email, dump credentials out of the system, add user accounts, move laterally, and so on and so forth. And actually, the initial exploit of Exchange did allow email theft, but it's the ability to execute commands through that exploit that gave the attacker the ability to put a second stage on the target, and the second stage gives them the ability to move out into other systems on the network. So there are some similarities between these, of course. In both cases, you see this access into the network or through the perimeter through a commonly used application in the organization, either by a compromised update or the exploit of zero-day exploits in the case of Exchange. One of the major differences between these is that the compromised SolarWinds servers seem to have been exploited by a single threat group, where the systems that were compromised by the Hafnium group are apparently being targeted by multiple groups who are taking advantage of those web shells that were exposed or created in the first stage. So once the vulnerabilities on the Exchange servers were exploited by the Hafnium group, they left in place second stage web shells that other attack groups could use, essentially opening up those servers to various threat groups who could use them for different purposes than the initial group was planning, which again is assumed to be espionage or intelligence collection. So just to give you kind of a sense of these and level set as we go in a little bit deeper. So you saw that we're connecting this webinar to the threat intelligence put out by CISA, and what we wanted to just kind of make reference to here is the fact that throughout these two attacks, there's a ton of both guidance coming from the government and threat intelligence in the form of specific things to look for and specific IOCs to describe the attack. So if you think about this just for SolarWinds, Mandiant, who first discovered this, did a report on December 13th of last year. CISA then issued their AA20-352A alert on December 17th. And then there were Microsoft reports on December 18th and January 20th. And all of these contained, steps that organizations needed to follow to determine whether or not they had been impacted by this. With Hafnium, we had a Microsoft report on March 2nd, a blog by Velexity on March 2nd. And Velexity got involved in this in a big way to show through incident response work that they had done to show very comprehensive and in-depth analysis of the threat. So they blogged about it on the 2nd. CISA published an alert on March 3rd, and then Mandiant on March 4th. So in both cases, you have quite a bit of information coming out saying that these threats are out there, these vulnerabilities are out there, that they're being actively exploited, that the attackers are using the following kinds of tactics. And so this raises, of course, in the mind of the security organization, of the information security team, am I compromised? And I think that this is unique in the sense that it's an important question. It's a hard question to answer because unlike a ransomware attack where it becomes quickly evident which systems are affected, in this kind of attack, we don't know. But at the same time, we have to guard against, and you say, okay, well, does it matter if I don't know? I mean, okay, maybe I'm just at risk of leaking out some information, just a few users' email accounts. Well, one thing to consider is that the few users whose email accounts leak out, often tend to be the ones that are going to do the most damage, whether it's the senior executives or the folks in HR who are conducting investigations. And secondly, we don't know how this access might be exploited down the road. So simply having access to systems is very, very problematic for the enterprise because ultimately this could become, the attacker could use this to disseminate ransomware. So the stakes are high. The question is important and hard to answer. Some common themes that we see as we look across the guidance and look across the threat intelligence as things that security teams need to do. And by and large, they're things like find these files. So in the case of SolarWinds, the very first question is, was the compromised DLL present on the system in the form on any system in my network in the form of an update? Was it actually running? In the case of Hafnium, were there web shells that were dropped onto the system that would allow the attacker to progress the attack beyond just the initial acquisition of email? There's a find these files question, and that may require, there's several different ways to handle that. Certainly one would be forensic imaging. Another would be to, do a live search of the system, of the target system. There's also, ways to look in logs and so on and so forth. The next, kind of common theme across the guidance is, there's this network activity that we've observed. So we now have observed the following servers that the attackers are using. So is there evidence that you have connected to any of these IP addresses, or you've attempted to, any systems on your network have attempted to resolve these domains? There's a need to sort of look backward and see if you have systems have done that. And then most of these reports or part of them make available these live attack tactics that have been observed in the wild, where the attacker is using specific techniques for persistence, techniques that match to the exploits that they have used in this particular case and that have proven to be successful over time. So how do you hunt for that, or how do you discover those indicators of hands-on keyboard attacks? And then finally, from a forward-looking standpoint, the guidance says you need to be alerting if there is communication from this point forward with these IP addresses, or if there are attempts to resolve these DNS names, or if any of these files show up in your network, or if these TTPs are observed. So a few of the common things that are evident in the CISA guidance and in the threat intelligence, and that what we'll do later in the presentation is show how with Nuix you can work through a lot of these questions. So I mentioned at the start that we would talk just a bit about some of the implications from a security standpoint. And, first and foremost, this is a reminder of the old security maxim that we tend to forget every couple of years, which is assume compromise, right? It's you should at all times be actively looking for threats on the network, because prevention alone doesn't keep them all out. The second one is around threat intelligence. So there is, of course, a lot of threat intelligence in the form of indicators in the guidance and in the industry reporting. But what we saw, for example, in the case of SolarWinds, is that the threat intelligence was available, somewhere on the order of 6 months or so after the attacks began. So useful from an investigative standpoint, but should not be depended on for detection. which brings us to behavior detection. And that's back to, the fact that the attacker tactics that are used in the second stage are things that are known, that have been enumerated, for example, in the MITRE ATT&CK framework, and that can be detected. And then the last one here is just that we did see some interesting awareness on the part of the attackers of the defenders. And we saw, for example, in the case of SolarWinds, a deletion of log activity on the target machine, efforts to suppress communication from some of their tools to avoid being detected by network detection. We saw attempts to compromise the email accounts of responders. So this is, I think, something that speaks to the importance of defense in depth and avoiding relying on any single tool or single approach, because the attackers will be trying to figure out what that is and to evade it. So I've been talking for a bit here. Bob, were there thoughts that you had as you looked across these couple attacks and what you think the implications are?
Hi, Hoke. Yes, as a matter of fact, one of the things that's critical in these attacks, while what we're talking about here, the SolarWinds and Hafnium, are retroactive or reactive investigations, it gives us the education for due diligence, so that we are prepared for those inevitable future attacks, and learning from the methodology and the capabilities that we can leverage to investigate these incidents give us a basis to look for similar compromises, vulnerability exploitations, or other investigative avenues that we need to explore going forward. And having those tool sets in place and ready to deploy immediately in the event of those future attacks is critical.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think studying this attack is really useful, from the standpoint of understanding how to get better and how to, I don't think it's unreasonable to think that while this may not be the new normal, it's definitely a threat scenario that everyone needs to be aware of and be probably more prepared for than most are. So in the next part of the presentation, we'll get into how Nuix can help. And just broadly speaking, we're going to be talking about two Nuix solutions: Nuix Adaptive Security, which is our endpoint product, and we'll show how Adaptive can help from the standpoint of blocking or alerting on behavior-based threats, triaging an alert that either comes from our product or from another product, doing a response, taking action on the host, like quarantining it and deleting files and terminating processes and so on, and ultimately also performing a collection, targeted collection of important artifacts from the host. And then Bob will cover Nuix Workstation and focusing on doing a forensic investigation of artifacts that are acquired during the first part of this scenario, as well as actually doing a full disk imaging of an affected host and going on a deeper dive into the artifacts on the image. So with that, I'm going to drop out of the PowerPoint here and switch over to a video that I've recorded that I would like to use to help me walk you through the SolarWinds and Hafnium response with Adaptive. So we're looking at the Adaptive Security dashboard here, and you can see up in the top left, it's alerts focus. So it's telling me, that I've got some active alerts out there, giving me a graphical count. My status of my endpoints is up at the top right. And then down here in the middle is the alerts that have been generated by the endpoint agent. So this is, of course, built on an architecture where endpoint agent is reporting back to a central server and generating these alerts as things happen. Now, the alert flow here is consistent with what would have actually happened in the attack, where we saw that after the download, the malicious download in the case of SolarWinds occurred, it began to beacon out. So you see these alerts at the top that say that NetFlow communication with Sunburst C2 happened and DNS communication with Teardrop C2 happened. So that's not necessarily what we would see actually in adaptive, but it's consistent with the actual chain of events in the case of the attack. Of course, we wouldn't be able to alert on these things in the case of SolarWinds until after we received the threat intelligence identifying the IP addresses. However, that doesn't mean that we couldn't detect the attacker in the case of SolarWinds. And so one of the first things that we can detect with adaptive security detections is this effort to circumvent logging on the target. So I mentioned that the attacker tried to do that. And so one of the things that they did was a very specific technique to suspend Windows logging using a Windows utility called audit poll. And they ran this exact command right here, audit poll, set the category to detailed tracking. And if it's a success, then disable that. And if it's not, then disable that. So that basically turns off logging in this using audit poll. And what adaptive allows the responder to do is to receive that alert and then instantly examine it here. So you can see when I click on the audit poll event or the command.exe event, I can see all of the sort of relevant information related to this. So one of the things that's a little interesting about this is that command.exe started up 4 different process events. And so we can easily examine that using this process visualization. And in fact, kind of everything that we need to triage that alert is right there in that visualization view. So let's take another, let's look at another example here. So second thing that attacker was observed to do in the case of the SolarWinds attacks was to modify the host firewall. Now they did that because one of their tools generated a lot of noise on the network. So this is sort of an unconventional use of a firewall, which is supposed to, of course, protect a host from compromise. What the attacker did was they used the firewall against the defender to suppress noise that their own tool creates in order to make it more difficult for network detections to find them. So they were going to run NS lookup commands that generated a lot of UDP traffic. They didn't want to tip the defenders off that was going to happen. So they executed a netshell command, and you can see it right here. This is the exact command that was used with a different firewall rule name. I've called it SolarWinds Evil, but it says on the for UDP protocol UDP outbound connections on port 137, block those. And that was something that they did to make it more difficult to detect their activities. Again, the visualization and adaptive gives the responder, the security team, kind of all the information that they need, or a quick view into the information that they need to triage this and see, for example, this is a very interesting instance of the parent process of NetShell. This is the Windows command processor, of course, and you can see that there are 11 things that it did, 11 more processes. And down here, as we can quickly just click on that and scroll through them to see that, okay, it also, it did something with SolarWinds business layer host.exe. It ran a series of ping commands, and we can see the command line for those ping commands over here. It ran the netshell commands, which are what created the alert. So that visualization gives us, a really powerful tool to do this triage. So we've covered 2 kind of out-of-the-box detections of SolarWinds that you would get with adaptive security. The next one is directed at persistence. Now, this was an interesting technique that was identified in the MITRE ATT&CK framework as a persistence technique. It's a modification of certain registry keys in Windows, which will allow an attacker basically to cause their malware to start up when a innocuous Windows process starts up. So they can add a command that says if process X starts, if application X starts on your system, then start up my malware. So what we're looking at here is the detection logic in adaptive security to detect this. And the product comes with around 120 of these detection rules. This is the one looking for persistence through this tactic. And you can see the logic is pretty simple. It just says if there's a registry set and the value name is debugger and the key name is either one of these two key names, then throw an alert. One of the things that we've discovered when using this in the wild is that it may be used by other applications. And so it's important to be able to configure it to whitelist certain behaviors that may be permitted in the enterprise. So, for example, we saw one case where administrators are using the set HC process in Windows, and you can see that here in the we actually used it to simulate this exploit. So at the end of the registry string there, you see the set hc.exe. So that means that the set hc.exe process will cause whatever we say, whatever we add to this registry key, to start up in response. And in some environments, that is used to trigger applications that administrators use to help users reset their passwords. So it's authorized use of this MITRE tactic that we know is exploited by bad guys. So the name of the game when it comes to this kind of detection is it's a bit of a tricky scenario, right? On one hand, we know it's being used. We saw that the SolarWinds attackers used it. It's one of hundreds of enumerated techniques that was actually used for this particular high-profile attack. So we need some means of detecting it. But if we detect it just without any appreciation for what's authorized within the enterprise, then we're going to get overwhelmed with noise. So it's important to be able to have control over that, to be able to configure our detections to allow certain things that are authorized while still giving us visibility into what the attacker may be doing. Okay, so now we're going to move down into another detection. This is not related to SolarWinds. This is related to Hafnium. So you'll recall that once the attacker got access, in the case of Hafnium, to the Exchange server, they began to pass commands to that server via web shell to begin to gain other access within the environment. And so one of the things that was observed was just the collection of credentials from the compromised Exchange server. And so that would, of course, encompass both the user's credentials, the local user, the main user of that box's credentials, as well as anyone who had logged on to that system. So the technique that was used was to dump out the LSAS process. And so the alert here is looking for that specific activity and showing us that procdump 64 was used to dump out LSAS. Now, somebody triaging this with adaptive security can easily go in and see exactly what, of course, the process was, who the user of that process was. And then as you see in the middle of the screen there, the file that was dumped out. So it was something called lsas.dmp that was written down to what we can see was a Windows temporary directory. And I'm looking just in the middle of the screen where it says file name here. So now investigator has the ability to go and grab that dump file and then take a closer look at it and see, okay, what credentials may have been exposed as part of this attack. And importantly, we have this record that says, yep, the attacker dumped credentials from this particular host. So it begins to give us, resolution into, what exactly happened if we were looking at this retroactively. If we were looking at this in real time, of course, from the perspective of adaptive, you've got the ability to do things like kill that process or isolate the host. So now I'm going to take a quick look here at the backwards, kind of the backwards looking scenario where assuming that the attacker had evaded our behavior detections, all is not lost. You still have, and if you have something like adaptive security, you have the ability to respond so much more efficiently. So the question, as you saw in the guidance there, for somebody who hadn't detected this on their network is, do you have this hotfix that SolarWinds pushed out? So the first thing you need to establish is whether or not that hotfix is present on your network. So the way that we're going here, and I think I wanted to just connect in the video there, just connect it back to the threat intelligence. But where we kind of would go from here in adaptive is to do a search on disk. So the triage that we've been doing so far is of events that the endpoint agent has collected and sent back to the server. Now we're going to move into a scenario where we're going to tell the agent, look for any instance of this file on the targeted system. So in this case, what I've done is I've created a search called SolarWinds MSP, where I'm going to look for that compromised update file. And I'm going to select my down select. I'm only going to run the search on servers that I know are running SolarWinds, on my SolarWinds servers. And that's going to produce a result like this one you see at the top here. So it's going to tell me, that my host, and I think we're going to add the host name up into the column view here. It's going to tell me that my host SolarWinds contains this hotfix in C administrator downloads. And that's going to, of course, give me the impetus I need, or the information I need to go and perform a collection and actually grab that file and either run it against something like virustotal, or maybe I'm going to give it to my malware reversers. But the first step is to search and see if the update's there. The next question, that I would have in the case of SolarWinds is, regardless of whether the update was present, did this DLL that we know was at the heart of this problem, do I have that evidence of that? Is it, written to disk? And so the next search here will just be looking for that DLL. And there it is. You can see, again, the threat intelligence, the very first report that came out on, I think it was December 13th, has this thing in it. So we want to know, where is this on my network? And in this case, we'll tailor the search again to just the SolarWinds box and look for any instance of that DLL. Now from here, we can pivot into a collection, and we don't actually need to go through all the searching here. This is a little bit more looking at, from a Hafnium standpoint, again, a search showing all the ASPX files. So in the case of Hafnium, there was some guidance to search for web shells in certain folders. So this search is showing that. And I'm going to fast forward a bit here just to get, because I don't want to take up all of Bob's time. But the next step that we're showing is using adaptive security, using Nuix adaptive security to collect all of the potentially affected DLLs. So we did a collection of both the MSP file and the update, as well as any DLL that matched our the file name that we were told about. We zipped that up and sent that back to the adaptive security server. So on the agent, it gets zipped up and encrypted and then sent back, and shows up as something like this, a container with the collected information in a password protected zip. And then we don't have to go through the opening here, but basically as we drill into that, we would see all of the DLL files that were collected. The final thing here is this sort of threat hunting process, where we want to look for attacker activity on our hosts without necessarily having to go through to take the time to collect, to completely image, process, and examine the box. And so the event data that we collect with adaptive security, and this is looking at process events, gives us a really powerful tool to do that. So in the example here, we're reviewing instances of the Windows command processor running on the SolarWinds box. in using the filtering in adaptive security to filter these events down, the process events down, to ones that are important and relevant for our investigation. So that pretty much covers the capabilities of adaptive to help you with doing searches, initial detection of the SolarWinds and Hafnium post-exploitation TTPs, to triage those, do search, do collection. And I will pause the adaptive part of this here and ask Bob if you would take over and show the Nuix and Workstation piece of this.
Sure. Okay. If you can stop sharing for me there, Hoke.
All right.
Okay. So as you can see, what we're looking at here is the Nuix imager interface. And what this allows us to do is examine our SolarWinds machine. And we did have a SolarWinds machine that Hoke and I leveraged for this. And we actually added online and reporting into his adaptive security server. So from here, what Nuix imager is showing us is that we can do a very targeted collection, the very specific items that are going to allow us to do our early case assessment. And if we look at this, I'll zoom in a little bit on the items selected for export. You can see that we're looking at some specific items, including PowerShell and the SolarWinds folders. So we want to look at those. And additionally, I found a bin file that was curious, so we included that in there as well. This allows us to take a look at how we're exporting that logical image. And I just included the resource monitor to show you that we're actually going to leverage the resources in this machine to speed up that export. The reason this is important is, as we know, the directive that the alert that Hoke had referenced, AA 20-352, recommended forensic examination of the potentially compromised machines. And that's exactly what we're doing here. This is Nuix Workstation processing that data that we've identified. We've done the targeted collection and we're pushing it into Nuix Workstation for a forensic analysis to understand specifically what we're dealing with. One thing that is important to understand is to even speed up this early case assessment, Nuix Workstation will allow users to process that data in place. So we see that we can have a very fast early case assessment by processing the data in place, or conversely, we want to preserve that data, we can collect it and process it as a physical or logical disk image or loose files and folder contents. So we can see here that we have the data processed in Nuix Workstation. One of the first things we can do is begin to execute searches based on what we learned from the alerts and the malware reports, the investigation reports that were submitted by multiple companies. And we can start to identify those files that were suspect. The second safe search you can see here is an MD5 hash. We can essentially search on whatever criteria has been identified as critical data in the investigation of these exploits and compromises. Additionally, we can look at our search and tag tab, and here I can bring in my search and tag and I can actually import a list of data. So I can compile this, and in this particular case, I get a spreadsheet of MD5 hashes. So we know that these are the Orion DLL MD5 hashes that were associated with the compromise. So I can simply import them directly into my search and tag, execute that search, and then move right over to my search and tag tab results. And I can see that I've got a total of 12 responsive items, and each of them is broken down. And again, we see that MD5 in the middle there that starts with D5AAD. We see 9 instances of that in the data set that we've collected. And keep in mind that our data set includes the SolarWinds VM targeted data that we collected. You'll notice that the next set of data we have in that document navigator is the post-event data that we collected as well, the update, and the adaptive security data that was pushed to us from the adaptive security alerts and file folder and activity that Hoke had identified in the monitoring. So now when we look at this, you'll also see that our responsive items are tagged, and we can go directly to the tagged items under our filtered items category on the left there, and we see those direct match responsive items, and we can examine them closely as well. The next thing we can look at is the entities, the named entities that Nuix identifies. If we've selected that processing option, we know that in this particular case, there are multiple named entities that are critical. So we can see here that we've got IP addresses and URLs. We can also identify the files that would be critical. But I'm going to focus initially on the IP addresses and simply change my view of my results to look at the IP addresses that were identified in my data sets, the multiple pieces of data that we've pulled together. And in this, we can start to see that the number of instances where those IP addresses were identified in the data sets and the MD5 hashes of the files associated with those, where those IP addresses were found. Next, we could change our view of entities to URLs, and we can start to see the URLs that were identified and go through this list of URLs or use our characters filter to narrow down to the specific URLs that were identified in the alerts and the vulnerability exploit research reports, and understand if those are on our data sets and where they're located, and investigate additional data about them, such as file access created and modified time and how they got on our systems. Next thing I want to look at is that suspicious bin file that we found. And here, if we look at this a little closer, we'll find that that file name is actually the SHA-256 value. And looking to the right in our preview tab, Nuix is going to identify the exact matches. So if I select those exact matches and we see that we have 3 of them, it's going to bring up a new tab. So if we look across the top, Nuix allows us to pursue investigative avenues without losing track of where we were. So we're opening up a new tab, a new investigative avenue. If it enriches our case, we're able to document that and include it in our results. If it turns out to be less than valuable to our reporting, we can simply go back to the previous tab and continue on a new investigative path. But what's interesting here is among those exact matches, we see that that hotfix 5 MSP is an exact match by MD5 hash for that bin file that we identified. So we can see that we have that in our data set, and we can investigate that further as well. The next thing I want to move on to is some of the other capabilities. Nuix allows us within the Nuix platform to investigate malware. In this case, I'm going to look at VirusTotal, but you'll see that we also have the Yara integration, and we'll touch on that as well. So using the VirusTotal, I can push this any suspected items, including in this case the hotfix 5 MSP, out to VirusTotal. And when I get my results back, you'll see here that the metadata is enriched with the data that came back from VirusTotal. So we push it out, VirusTotal examines it and identifies all of the times that it was reported to VirusTotal. If you look at the very last line in the preview pane to the right, the last line tells us there's a total of 52 VirusTotal hits. We could see all the sources and how those sources identified it, confirming what Hoke had identified in adaptive security. We see that this is the Sunburst and Trojan, and multiple sources have identified it as that Sunburst Trojan and as a backdoor. The next thing we're going to look at is, as I mentioned, the Yara integration. In this case, we can add multiple Yara rules and then push them out, and we're going to identify what's been reported based on the yara rules. And you can see here, I went to the second tab. I'm only going to use the one yara rule set, the SolarWinds credential stealer. When I process that, we're going to see the results, and it's going to push it back in and tag those items that are responsive with the additional information that came back to us through the yara. Now, again, we're back to that bin file that we know is an exact match for the MSP, the hotfix. And as I look at that, I can go over to my preview tab on the right and select the entities tab and identify all of the IP addresses or any of the other named entities that were identified in this data set. So we're able to go through that more closely. One of the next investigative steps that I might want to take is I take these two items, the bin file, and we've already identified that SolarWinds Orion Improvement Common DLL. I can select those and simply push them into our database viewer. So I can select the show option and show in database viewer. And when I do, it's going to open up now another tab. So I see my registry and database viewer, and I can actually go through the text of these files and see exactly what's occurring in the course of these files. So when I examine malware, I can examine the code in a relatively safe environment. As I go through, I can find additional pieces of information, in this case, the MD5 hash of another file that I'm able to investigate further as well. Some of the next things I might want to look at are those logs that came in from the adaptive security server. In this particular case, I have that hotfix 5 MSP file. And as I look through the sequence of events here, we see that the hotfix 5 MSP file has an event type of rename. And there's something I may want to investigate further. So when I grab that, I may want to pivot around that rename. So I can simply select that item, again, right click and select my pivot option, and I can pivot by location or time. So in this particular case, we're going to pivot by time, and we get to see everything, and we have some preset values, but we're able to look at the additional activity that took. I'm going to select everything that occurred within a minute around that rename event. And when I look at it, you'll see just about in the center there, I have that hotfix 5 MSP file, and right below it is a write. And when I zoom in on that, I can see that it created a temp file. So these are the types of things we want to investigate further. In this case, as we investigate further, we'll see it was a delete, but this is one of the ways that we can envision persistence being established on a compromised machine, because it rewrites it, pushes it into a temp directory or pushes it into another folder where we weren't necessarily going to expect it or see it. We could see that we have this temp file, I could grab it and search for it everywhere else in my data set. And here you can see that we've got roughly a minute after the write, we've got a delete. So we've renamed it, wrote it to the temp file, and then we see a delete activity of that temp file as well. But it didn't necessarily have to be deleted. It could have remained on the machine as persistence and then been reactivated after it was suspected to be cleared. So in the last few minutes that I have available, what I'm going to do is go live into my Nuix case. This is one of the things I did want to share with you. This is the alert that Hoke and I both have referenced in this presentation. But stepping down into the steps, the guidance provided by CISA, step 1 was forensically image the system memory and host operating systems and all affected versions of the SolarWinds, and analyze for new user accounts, privileged and otherwise, and also analyze the stored traffic for indicators of compromise. As I showed you in the slideshow, we've done most of that. Now what we're able to do is work through this. And as I showed you earlier, I can save those saved searches. I can simply grab them, paste them in, and run my search very quickly. In this particular case, I can look for this DLL, and it'll tell me every instance of where this was identified in my data set. And it'll also highlight where it was found. I can do this with all of the saved searches that I created, and you can see here that I have these items already identified. Some of the other things we could do, as I mentioned before, was the search and tag. In this particular case, I've already imported some, but I'll import another set just very quickly. I can grab, for instance, the IP addresses. And when I grab that, I can populate it and now execute those searches just that fast. That's a live search that we just saw, and we can see everything that may have shown up here. Again, I can augment this, or I can save it. Next thing I could do is clear this out and bring in, for instance, the DLLs, or the file names. So if I wanted to bring in the DNS, I could, or the file names, I'll bring them in, and it'll give me, again, results. In this particular case, we have quite a few. I can move back to my Workbench tab, and as I look over here to my tagged category, I could see all of the results that were updated with that data as well. Some of the next things I want to do is be able to open up a new Workbench tab and look at where else are we going to find these relevant pieces of information. So I can look at the entities that we looked at. I think some of the things that we want to be able to do quickly, just to close this out, is look at all of those exact matches. So I can move to the results that we found here. Again, I can look at the bin file and select it and look at those exact matches. And now I can grab those examples of the hotfix 5 MSP, and I can run that again, as I had shown you, for the malware or for the yara rules, and then examine those in the database viewer. We can look at the pivoting around our data, and then we can also see where is there relevant pieces of information that we want to include in our report. And then as we get down to clearing this out, I can see all of the items that I tagged. Additionally, some of the other pieces of information I can do is create my case notes. So I can open up a case note tab, and as I create this, I can start adding case notes of relevant information I found in my case file and be able to include those in my reports as I generate the results of my examination. We're getting down to about 2.5 minutes left, so I'm going to open it up for questions and turn it over to you, Corey.
Oh, thanks, guys. So we just have a couple of questions to ask. So the first one, how do you deal with false positives and avoid overwhelming your security team?
So I'm assuming that's gonna focus on sort of the endpoint monitoring piece, Corey, and that is that's a key issue. One of the things that I think is really unique about Nuix Adaptive Security is its ability to basically configure around the legitimate activity. So that one persistence example is a good one because it is used for legitimate uses by in enterprises. So I don't want to get alerts every time it happens. And so with adaptive, you can essentially whitelist out the innocuous activities. So I think that's one aspect of it, is that configurability. Another is just the basic truth that just because a tool will detect a threat, that doesn't mean that an enterprise security team will detect that threat. And so enabling operators to be able to deal with these kinds of alerts and giving them the ability to quickly triage them, becomes all the more important.
Right on. And Bob, I think this one's kind of going to be tailored to you. If an investigation leads to other sources of data, can you add those sources to your existing Nuix case?
Yeah, I'll handle that, Corey. As a matter of fact, yes. in this example that we are looking at, I'll share my screen up again. We could see here that I've augmented my data set from the original disk image we created, but we could see here that in this particular case, I can add case evidence. So as we learn more, for instance, in this case, Hoke found the data from the adaptive security server, the alerts, the files, and the loaded modules, and he forwarded those over to me. And what we were able to do is add them in again and federate them with our entire data set, so we get a much more holistic view of the entire data set that we need to examine and understand the circumstances or the factors involved in this vulnerability compromise much more clearly to be able to report on the results.
Great. Well, thank you guys. Any final comments before we close out the webinar?
I would just say again, thank you to those of you who tuned in. We really appreciate your time. Hopefully, you know, at one level, there was a simple workflow here, right? Which was identify and collect suspected malware with Nuix Adaptive Security, and then examine it using yara rule analysis and comparison to virustotal and hash analysis in Nuix Workstation. So hopefully, I don't know that we presented it completely perfectly like that, but hopefully it came across. And again, thank you so much for your time.
Well, guys, thank you so much, and for everybody who watched, we do appreciate you taking the time to join this webinar, and hope that we will see you in future webinars. Obviously, get connected with Nuix at all of the spots that you can see on the screen if you haven't already, and we will close this out. It looks like pretty much right on time, or a minute over. So thank you, and have a great rest of your day.